Hello and welcome back. Now we go into the second of our trios, and in this case we'll start off with Francois Prenz, and then we'll listen to René Taube talking about Rome, and then Nigel Coates will talk about film in his work. Francois Prenz, professor at Cambridge University, and has been working with, I think, could call it an imaginary museum of life through cinematic images. And he recently published a book that was launched here last autumn. So I give you Francois. Thank you.
My talk will be in two parts. I will talk about a large HRC project which I'm involved with at the moment. I'm the principal investigator of the Cinemuse Space project, a cinematic musée imaginaire of spatial cultural differences. It's a 2.5-year project. We are 6 months in, so this is really the beginning of the project. What we're trying to do with this project is trying to see how we can elicit cultural differences through analysis of space through the medium of cinema. And the cultural differences is between Europe and the US versus China and Japan in particular. So it's very interdisciplinary, involves a lot of people, but I will explain that later on. But the project is based on a book which was published last year, which is a cinematic everyday life approach to architecture. And I need to explain some of the hypotheses in this book in order for us to understand what the research project is about. So I'll start with that. The RIBA plan of works, we're all familiar with that. Always a good idea to show that in the School of Architecture. Simply to mention that architects, we hope, are very good at brief design, etc. But when it arrives to the usage of the building, they're sort of obviously very busy moving to the next building, and very often architects do not really understand how the building works. There are very few, that's what the RIBA is often mourning, but there's very little post-occupancy studies. Very few books and very few articles about this topic. Perhaps this is one of the few. And I think this morning somebody mentioned Wim Wenders already. But of course, filmmakers need buildings, they need space, and here we have in this very interesting small films that Wim Wenders made about the Relics building in Lausanne. He's standing there inside talking to Sana, architect, Japanese architect of the building. I think it was a film which was presented at the Venice Biennale in 2010. Essentially, over the past sort of 125 years, cinema has built and represented many different houses and buildings, has archived and expressed, characterized, interpreted, portrayed hundreds and literally hundreds and thousands of buildings, streets, and situations. It constitutes a massive archive that I would put to you that cinema has unwittingly documented what I call the accidental archive, which makes visible how we live, love, and sleep in buildings. And it constitutes the most comprehensive lived-in building data in existence, which is very much an ignored and untapped resource. There are many different ways of data mining this extraordinary archive, and one of them is the study of the everyday. So I'll I'll talk a little bit about the importance, what I think is the importance of the everyday and everyday life in architecture. A huge influence for me was this man, Henri Lefebvre, critique de la vie quotidienne. Of course, what he was trying to do is that he was trying to study the everyday life in order to change it. Not just to show my age, but I was taught by Henri Lefebvre. He was my tutor in the first year in Lausanne in May 1971. We had him for a whole week. And just to show the sort of, this is his handout. And he had already by that time published 2 of the volumes of the Critique de la vie quotidienne, which was very much something that we all had to read, but of course we also had to read about Marx, etc. So also to show that how very different the schools of architecture are nowadays, that we were very political. Of course, I'm the generation of sort of May 68, but we were very much engaged throughout my curriculum. I was engaged with social housing and politics, etc. And of course, this has stayed with me. Huge influence, of course, is also Georges Perec. What we call everydayness is not evidence, but opacity, a form of blindness, a mode of anesthesia. It's from those basic remarks that this book has developed a diary of a user of space. Difficult to talk about the everyday without mentioning Michel de Certeau's practice of everyday life. We could talk about what happened in the US at the time, learning from Las Vegas, but in this country, of course, it wasn't called really the everyday, it was called the ordinary. This was the Smithson, and there was a lot of interest, of course, right from the 50s. I will talk about that later. In America, this first book appears, I think, in 1997. Henri Lefebvre is not translated in English before the early 1990s. In this country, of course, there's this very interesting AD, the everyday and architecture, sort of reversal of edited by Sarah Wigglesworth and Jeremy Till. And I like this quote in their introduction: any discipline which denies the everyday will be denied every day, and for this reason, high architecture is unraveled by the habitual and banal event which mark the passage of time. So there's a sort of dichotomy between, the everyday architecture and the iconic, but I haven't got time to go into that. There are some practices which call themselves ordinary architecture, or Tom Emerson's 6A architecture practice for everyday life, and in a way, I see the idea of the modest. This publication is another way of talking about the everyday and the ordinary. Some of you will recall, I never seem to find anybody who knows about the Farrell Review of Architecture and the Built Environment, but I'm sure Paul Finch will remember that. And which they talk very much about changing the culture of planning and improving the everyday environment by making the ordinary better. Of course, they talk about the everyday environment and not necessarily talk about the everyday life. The two are very much intertwined. In terms of film theory, Gilles Deleuze, in his second book, Cinema 2, sees the everyday as an important component of his theory. In every banality, the action image and even the movement image tend to disappear in favor of pure optical situation. He would cite, of course, Italian neorealist cinema like Umberto D, a key example of everyday banality. And of course, Tokyo Story and Ozu, which Deleuze sees as the quintessential filmmaker who has elevated the everyday at the level of a cinematic art form. in this country, of course, we should not forget this very interesting movement on film, the Free Cinema Manifesto. Part of the manifesto is the belief in freedom, in the importance of people, and the significance of the everyday. Now, Perec was hinting at a literary enterprise which was associated with an anthropology of proximity and a sociology of the everyday, while I construe film text as a spatial ethnography of the everyday. And I'm not here proposing a novel study of everydayness or a new interpretation per se, but thinking of examining the everyday life through the lens of cinema and the moving image. Indeed, we may be very well blind to our own everyday, but we are definitely very good at observing other people's everyday, and particularly on the screen. One film which has been very important to me, should be playing, it's not. Okay. Is this film, Jeanne Dillman, by Chantal Ackerman. Chantal Ackerman very sadly passed away a couple of years ago now. I would say that this is perhaps one of the sort of slow cinema, of course, is ideal for the study of the everyday and the domesticity. It's a film which, as you may recall, it depicts the life of this woman who lives in a flat in Brussels, and she has very sort of regular patterns over 3 days, and she's a widow, and she supplements her income by prostituting herself every day between 5 and 5:30. On the second day, she burns the potatoes, probably enjoyed herself too much, and she gets very unhinged. And on the third day, she kills her client. Now, I know this is a spoiler, but I still recommend you to watch what is in fact a very wonderful film. And it's a very careful examination of domesticity. I mean, it's a film over 3 hours, and it's filmed on location in a flat in Brussels, and of every possible moment of the day in action, and of course the moment like dining, etc. There are many, many different forms of cinematic everyday life. For example, Boyhood, I'm sure many of you would have seen, would constitute what I would call a longitudinal study of everyday life over 10 years. If you remember, as the family grows up, they move from different cities, different sort of environment, different everyday life. To complexify things, in his last book, Henri Lefebvre talks about éléments de rythme analyse, elements of rhythm analysis, which is very interesting because he makes the point that not only have we got our own everyday rhythm, but also we have to think of the circadian rhythm, which is sort of superimposed into that, which is the day to night, and is the season, the rhythm of the body, etc. So it's sort of, and that's his ultimate theory about the everyday. And I had studied the wonderful film by Joanna Hogg, film Modernist House, not far from here. And this was the cover of the book, so we can see over 10 days how this couple is moving around the space and using the space. And she very clearly shows the beginning of the day and the end of the day over 10 days. What is very important also in this study is the disruption of the everyday. And in this case, it's the visit of the estate agent on day 3. They are about to sell the house, they're about to move. This is the element of drama. In the case of Jeanne Dillman, of course, it was a more important drama because it was a murder. So you have everything in between. And so my hypothesis here is that the first important element is to think that film is a taxonomy of everyday lives in everyday spaces, and I use the term taxonomy here, reserved for the classification of observed empirical entities. And this is a short extract of a very nice film, which doesn't seem to play again. Kitchen Stories, many of you would know this film, is a metaphor really what how I'm using the film. So this is a Swedish sociologist they are studying Norwegian men and how they behave in space, how they use the space, in order ultimately to optimize the use of their kitchen. And of course, the man Isaac, the man who is being studied here, is not very happy with this, and he does absolutely everything to annoy the guy who is on the Empire chair. So essentially, what I'm suggesting is that we have to try to we have to be on the Empire chair when we study film, and we have to observe what the camera has observed, and we can turn cinematic scenes into data and compile statistics out of drama for the purpose of analyzing the everyday. Now, I realized when I analyzed Jean Dillman that, of course, it was recalling early attempts at standardization centered around the kitchen. Came to mind, of course, the first publication of the Neufert's Architects' Data, which dates back from 1936. The next, probably the next offering in a long line of architectural standardization efforts, probably better known nowadays to students, is a Rem Koolhaas exhibition, part of the Venice Biennale, which took place in 2014. And he worked with the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and they published those 15 books, those 15 elements, and many of you would have gone to see this exhibition and would recall that all the different elements were sort of pulled apart, and that's an example of the book. And as you see at the top here, he goes back to the Neufert indeed, and this is a this way of looking at architecture, dissociated architecture, of course, goes back to Frampton's studies in tectonic of culture. So the second part of what I was working on, the first part was the everyday life in everyday spaces. The second part is what I call an architectonic of cinema, which is concerned with key buildings elements that pertain to architecture, windows, doors, walls, etc., showing how the many functions are cinematically practiced and revealed, throwing new light on building elements that are often taken for granted. I studied something like 250 films, so I'll show you just a couple of examples. For example, doors can go from these sort of early, none of my clips need to, sort of Tree of Life, sort of what would be called the door of discovery to doors as threshold and steady space.
Tudod, nagyon jó, hogy szeretlek.
A wonderful film by Bellatar. But of course, in cinema, more often than not, a door is a cut. And we can see here the servant, Dick Bogart, coming into the room. And if we think about it, there's probably more people in cinema entering spaces than coming out of it. And this is the plan of the Villa Savoie. The movement of coming inside the space is expressed graphically in architecture. There's a sort of quarter round. And also in the vocabulary, in the language, we talk about the entrance. We could call it the exit hall, but we don't. We call it the entrance hall. Same in French, same in most languages. But perhaps one of the great film about doors, which says an awful lot about also the how people use doors, is and being on the threshold of doors, not able to enter, is the Dalton brothers, 2 days, 1 night, when the main character has to try to convince people to give up a bonus so she can keep her job, and she sort of has 2 days, 1 night, sort of over a weekend, she has to go and talk to people, and sort of we have all those different insight of different sorts of building, very interesting taxonomy. The equivalent, if you had to perhaps only see one film and study windows, I would suggest that L'Église by Antonioni is a wonderful film set in Rome, an extraordinary sort of idea of thinking of windows as communication, dreaming, windows that separate, windows that unite, interrogate, and windows that hide. A formidable typology proposed here by Antonioni. Of course, I'm sure he wasn't thinking of doing that for us, but we have to be grateful, I think, and that challenges complement what the humble window is for. Windows are not just for light, to prevent the warmth to get out, or thinking of U value, but there's a whole new dimension, also very much dreamlike and poetic, that we can engage with. Stairs are very interesting. Stairs, of course, are very dangerous. The stairs kill 1,000 people a year in this country. Maybe it's not the way to put it, but 1,000 people die on average per year from stair falls, and that has been this sort of inherent dangerosity of stairs is seen in Hitchcock. This is Rebecca. Stairs are sort of maybe a site of doubt and anxiety, or it could be people who I never saw you before, I never want to see you again. To express a power relationship. Of course, the ultimate stair scene is this one in Hitchcock and Psycho. Stairs are a wonderful place especially at the top of the stairs, because you are very unlikely to recover from your fall. Actually, the safest of stairs, so the literature tells us, is the spiral staircase, which probably is the oldest staircase, which Godard used there here as a symbol of modernity in Alphaville, partly because you can break your fall. There's also inherently a directionality. The stairs, the arrow goes up in the architectural convention, and I think that if you think about it, most architects would probably think of stairs as something as going up as opposed to going down. Cinema sometimes has challenged that, the ambiguous stairs, and you don't quite know whether she's going up and down until this man appears, and of course, we are going down. So, the conclusion of this part is to say that the elements of architecture are associated with active verbs. Is the act of passing through a door, window, looking for a window, or climbing a glacier, which is an authentic architectural experience, a dimension that can only be revealed through movement, or movement through the gaze, not the door or the window in itself. To which, of course, to the active elements of verb, we need to add the emotional, the affect dimension. Okay, very quickly, the project Cinemiospace is a revelator of spatial cultural difference, so we build from that. Space is an expression of our culture and history, materialized in stone, concrete, and glass. Cinema is a spatial form of culture. Cinema can be construed as a container and interpreter of, cultures. that is, I think for architects, is particularly precious in order to deepen our knowledge of other cultures, because I think there's a common misconception that in a globalized world, spatial parameters are seen as interchangeable and transposable. I think it's not true. It's not because we all have an iPhone across the world or the same phone that we're all the same. And I think that we can tease out some interesting differences. Let's think, for example, I mean, what is a wonderful film, Rear Window by Hitchcock, of a study of everyday life in an urban block in New York circa 1953, is in fact, of course, a particular way of using the window, which is window is very voyeuristic. By contrast, for example, in Ozu, window is a site of contemplation, and here's the father-in-law and his brother-in-law just sort of, and son-in-law are just simply contemplating the snow falling outside. So in Eastern cinema, what we see very in general is that we can see that the surroundings are an extension of the self, while in Western or in Western cinema, nature has to be conquered and tamed. It's sort of very, very important difference. Another important difference that I'm very attracted to, and that goes back to what we were talking about this morning, is the work from Team Lab. They had a very interesting exhibition in January, February, March last year. Some of you may have seen it. This is a huge organization based in Tokyo, which I had the opportunity to visit a few weeks ago. And they are actually going back to, they are just saying, well, in Japan, the Renaissance meant something very different, and we are wanting to go back to pre-Renaissance perspective. We want to go back not only to the pre-Edo, to the Heian period, the 11th century period. Probably all remember those extraordinary sort of scrolls, Japanese scrolls, essentially talking about describing cities and space in 2 dimensions. And they're saying, well, we are doing digital work which is entirely 2-dimensional, so we're not interested in perspective. So this is sort of the anti-VR movement, the anti-augmented reality movement, and they call that ultra-subjective space. And the spaces they create are just absolutely quite extraordinary. So I think when we think of those different examples, they have very different sensibility. That was, in a way, announced by Philippe Descola, anthropologist in France, and he created this wonderful exhibition that I was lucky to see in 2010 at the Musée du Quai Branly, La Fabrique des Images, the making of images, where he proposes 4 ontologies of the world, 4 different systems of qualities in objects and in artworks, which correspond to different cultures. There's animism. Our world is, the second one from the left is naturalism, the mimetic world, totemism, and analogism, which is the world that he put forward is the world of China and Japan in particular, but also part of West Africa and part of South America, which represent the discontinuity among both the body and the interiority of the relationship. He shows some example at the end of the exhibition, which shows that on the surface, when we look very quickly, we think those are landscapes, but they are the same sort of, I think they are 16th century landscapes, both of them, the Chinese landscape and a French landscape, but it's the Chinese painting is about the resonance between the cosmos and the painter. By painting the mountain and the water, it figures the place of the human body in the world. So totally different philosophical position, although on the surface they may look very similar. We have enrolled Philippe Descola to be part of our project. He's very intrigued to think of how we could interpret cinematic images to be iconic of cultures, and we are currently struggled with this notion. We started a number of empirical studies with our partners in China, looking at various type of spaces. This is the Hutong in Beijing, and following the sort of a circadian rhythm, looking at everyday life in the living room, in the kitchen, in the bedroom, in the street, and realize also that, for example, the street in many of us film is a very different way of thinking of the street. It's like the street is an extension of the home in a very interesting way, but there's no private garden. And recently we were in China and Japan, and we did our own little everyday life project by filming around us, and indeed this is the tennis court in the volleyball court in the university compound where we were staying, but it's used by the general population in a very interesting way, and in a way that we would certainly not see in the West. Now, where we are now is that we have collected all this material. We're starting to assemble materials. There will be sort of probably up to 100 films. And we're putting that in a film pool, and we're trying to analyze, for example, let's have some keyword, opening the door and seeing how things are being confronted and arriving sometimes, talking about the phone, at some very weird, what we call peculiar findings. Exactly the same shot in Lake Lease, 1962, Poor Cow by Ken Loach, 1967, very, very odd. Or writing a letter to women, two very, very different films, writing a letter by a window. I mean, of course, we have to let the data speak, and I think this will take a while. The notion of musée imaginaire, of course, comes from Malraux. André Malraux was the first person really to think in his sort of Musée de la Sculpture Mondiale to get confronted very different sculptures from very different countries, which he arranged through visual analogy. We are planning next year a number of exhibitions. Centre of Chinese Contemporary Art, Manchester, moving to national museums in Liverpool, and then there'll be an exhibition in Shanghai and Tokyo. This is the team. We have collaborators in Japan, China, Singapore, and then we're working closely with School of Museum Studies. Susan MacLeod is the co-investigator. It's very important for us to understand, to create this installation, to see how people are going to react and try to get data out of it. This is us visiting Team Lab. Team Lab would be involved in the Tokyo project. And we did a series of workshops, both in Tokyo and in China, and so this is one example. This is just a 90 seconds piece, and it shows the idea was to look at Chinese gardens and how Chinese gardens are constructed, but it also, so it broached this idea of nature, but nature in the city. It reveals also how artificial the Chinese garden is and how artificial filming is, and also talks about this idea of two-dimensionality. So, and this is a film essay. Thank you very much.
My talk is somewhat more playful in that I pick up on some of the points that have been brought up in previous discussions, and I take them in a particular direction. The stories that we tell ourselves about cities and the fantasy that's Rome, a city where everyone has always told their own stories and made up their own narratives and created their own herb. My methodology looks at film as if we're sitting in Plato's cave. The particular story is Peter Greenaway's film Belle-Even Architect, and I'll say I'm not claiming this is a great film. But it takes place in Rome. It's made in the 1980s. And in the film, an American architect, or an American really, in the style of Henry James, visits Rome in order to prepare an exhibition of the works of neoclassical architect Boulez at the somewhat neoclassical and entirely eclectic monument Vittorio Emanuele, commonly called the Vittoriano. His Italian counterparts siphon off funds to restore Rome's monuments from the fascist era. The film came about because Greenaway came to Rome on a visit, suffered from indigestion, and devised the plot for the film. The film itself is what I describe as a handbag of monuments, loosely held together with a plot that pits neoclassical rationality against classical imperialism. So Rome in film manifests itself according to specific filmmakers' perspectives. And all cities have this identity in film. And there are different kinds of Roman films. While Italian neorealist films strove to cultivate the opposite of monumentality of Rome, the English abroad celebrates the place and position of temples, monuments, and civic buildings. The film is presented as a sequence of postcard images of Rome that alternate with actual shots in the style of postcards. And in case you missed that the Vittoriano, of which you see a model here, is also called the typewriter. This old-fashioned typewriter, you see in the bottom left, is often seen someplace in the scene, as here, where it actually sits next to the model of the building, like a sort of scale study. The first monument is the Pantheon, and in the film it's applauded by the characters, and it itself is inspiration for much neoclassical building, including Boulez's Cenotaph to Newton, which in the postmodern way, Cracklight, remember this film was made in 1986, Cracklight, the architect, plays with a series of photocopies, then prepares a montage of sketches in which he shows how he identifies with both the building and the emperor who built it as Hadrian made it becomes Cracklight made it. And this sort of tells the story of the film, which begins with conjugal relations on a train entering Italy, which we sort of see vaguely in the top right, and ends with a sort of flaccid penis and guts spilling out of the belly of the architect and his demise at the end. But we see here how Hadrian made it becomes Cracklight made it. The film references other films and paintings and iconic imagery, and in some scenes the Vittoriano is filmed to look as if Albert Speer might have designed it. There's a strong theme of water throughout the film, such as this scene set supposedly in a bath, and Cracklight's first name, Stourley, that refers to a running stream. This is actually filmed at the Villa Odaleschi, which is a privately owned villa in Rome. Central to a discussion of imperialist and fascist politics lies a nostalgia for Rome's glorious past. The architect, however, as architects do, sees himself as somewhat grand and imperial, and not unlike Benito Mussolini, identifies with the Emperor Augustus. He poses as a deified ruler inspired by the monuments he's visited. As I've said, here we go, here's posing. Sorry, I can just go back to that. Okay. The film's full of filmic references. For example, a scene in a photographic studio set in the EUR, or although actually filmed in a pasta factory near Testaccio, references Antonioni's blow-up. And another scene at the Arapacis references Bernardo Bertolucci's fascist commentary in The Conformist and the seat of power under Caesar Augustus. This is my own photo, not from the film. Greenaway has his conflicted hero walk in front of the inscription of the Res Geste in exactly the same manner as Bertolucci's Conformist. My feeling about film is that we watch it on the screen, we create in our imaginations a whole 3 or even 4-dimensional world, as if we're creating a map in our mind. And then we leave that world and we walk out into the real city, bringing with us all the feelings and emotions that we might have experienced, or our expectations about what cities are or what they possibly can be. This is a good place to introduce Piranesi. Piranesi and Boulez were exact contemporaries. Piranesi, too, like Boulez, in comparison to his prodigious output of drawings, hardly built anything. His most famous built project is the Piazza and Church for the Cavalieri di Malta on the Aventine Hill. And this is the famous portal with a keyhole that cites the dome of St. Peter's. I show images from the film, images from postcards, and vedute, highly detailed cityscapes, along with maps and of some of the monuments of Rome, using the Greenaway film as a premise to explore the city. Each of the vedute tells a little story. The vedute are early engravings that were reproduced many times, like Piranesi's are the most well-known. And they're full of little incidents. And one of the things that I discovered in examining them, I looked at thousands, they often have dogs in them. And although there's a famous cat sanctuary in Rome, dogs are everywhere, and each of the dogs in the vedute tells its own little anecdote that relates to the way that the monument itself has been depicted, whether the dog's hunting, whether the dog's part of a sort of vagabond on a journey, whether the dog's part of a sort of posh couple going for a walk to look at St. Peter's. The bottom right, did that dog cause the incident between the two people? Is there a dog sniffing around the fountain or gnawing on a bone? Just as historically, the frontispiece of a building broadcasts its symbolic functions by means of its figuration and ornamentation, and a city gate presents a clear urban image, a film's title sequence can offer its viewer a lens of meaning through which to read the suite of events. As the Greenaway film begins, the camera swings round the Piazza di Popolo, historical gateway to Rome from the north on Via Flaminia. Greenaway lingers meaningfully over the twin churches framed symmetrically as they were planned to be seen. The camera stops and the opening credits come up on the screen. This formal framing opens the film as if the curtains have been drawn. As viewers, or we can call ourselves tourists, we feel we're getting somewhere. We've arrived. This still segment of the shot lasts about a minute, which is a very long time in film. As in all films, Belli is highly selective in the Rome it presents to viewers, not dissimilar to those maps of Rome discussed by Aldo Rossi and others that include only the monuments with none of the interstitial fabric, or even Mussolini. Greenaway ignores the medieval and the Baroque. Greenaway originally intended to trace a route through the city, structured almost like a situationist derive, by using postcards chosen for their perspective, each of which connected a monument in the foreground with another in the distance. For example, by using a postcard of the twin churches in Piazza del Popolo, in which one could find in the background a small image of part of the Vittoriano, the next scene would be set in the Piazza Venezia, and if in that postcard one could glimpse the Colosseum in the background, then the next scene would take place there, and so on and so on. I start here, as Greenaway did, with the Piazza del Popolo. The twin churches in which Bernini collaborated with Rinaldi are exactly the kind of neoclassical church that Joseph Rickford describes as a domed space with a temple portico. They act as a secondary gateway to create the trident, whose central axis leads to the Vittoriano. And if you were standing there by the obelisk today and you looked down the Corso, which is the street in the middle, you would see the Vittoriano standing there. Just as if you were standing at the Vittoriano, you would look up and you would be able to see the obelisk. In Roman architecture, whatever lies on axis is of principal significance. The Piazza del Popolo that we're familiar with today has an elliptical shape that was put in by Valadier in the 19th century. It was originally an oblong, which we see here, and different views, the Ripetta on the right, and dogs playing, people walking, a sort of active presentation of the entrance to the city, inviting you to go down. And the position of the viewer is always determined by where you want the obelisk to be. Is it blocking the street? Is it blocking the monument because everything is central? Or do you have to stand to one side or to the other side? That's the elliptical Valadier Piazza del Popolo. Maps, which we create in our mind as we watch a film or move through a city, are how we articulate and navigate space. They don't just show us where we are or where we want to be, but they map out our conceptions of where and who we are. Maps are windows into thoughts and perceptions, values, and the spirit of the times in which they're made. This is a view of the Piazza del Popolo on the left. And I became interested in the formation of the trident. You can really see the three streets here in these different maps, as an urban artifact, and the spatial reasoning in the evolution of the piazza itself. And I may just pause for a minute to say what's quite obvious. One is a planar map, and the other is axonometric, what was called skiography at the time, to show the shadows and the dimensionality. And although the original maps were drawn prior to the construction of the twin churches by Rinaldi, we can see in the map on the right that they've been put in plan later. And you can clearly see how the trident adds form to the city of Rome itself. They're called Design and View of the Holy City of Rome, or New Map of Rome, to show particular aspects of the city that they wanted to focus on, usually the pilgrimage churches. Like later maps, they were intended, indeed dedicated, to bring to the front the magnificent history of Rome's urban growth and urban development. They were designed and engraved on 12 copper plates and became tourist guides of the city. And here you can see, if you know Rome at all, can I show you here? Can I do this? This is where the Spanish Steps are. So this is prior to the construction of the Spanish Steps. And the same thing here, the Spanish Steps. And if you follow this along, you can see that you get to the four fountains before the construction of Borromini's church. But this is what Rome actually looked like at the time, because there was a world outside the city walls, the Aurelian walls, and it looked not unlike what it did on the inside. So this was a completely different depiction of how to present the city. And here we see the Piazza del Popolo as the urban gateway. There's no people in any other part of this map, and I'm just showing one part, but in the entire map, the only people that you see are in the Piazza del Popolo, where you have people walk around, people talking, running, carrying things, to show that this is the urban gateway. Here we have a dog running around in the Piazza del Popolo. And there's different resolution for these maps because they were reproduced at smaller scale because they were used as tourist brochures. Here we have the Spanish Steps, or the Trinita de Monte, before the construction of the Spanish Steps, when it was already a tourist destination. And a close-up of that as well. How many people can you jam into one square? So these are different maps from the same map from 100 years apart by the same artist, obviously redrawn. The one on the right showing something more active than the one on the left, which is considered to be far more scientific. In addition to our friend Tempesta, whose maps we've just been looking at, we also have these maps by Etienne Dupeyrac. Dupeyrac came from France to Rome to investigate classicism. He arrived in Rome to study the antiquities, and using existing ruins and urban artifacts coupled with writings, he created a reconstruction of ancient Rome in 1574, imagining what it might have been. He made these axonometric maps of Rome, and worked with existing monuments and writings from Roman times to create his imagining of what imperial Rome might have been like. And he created also very large copper plates, about 12 of them. I show several of them here, as if it was filled with Roman architecture, using some existing monuments. Sometimes you can see the Pantheon and the Colosseum. Sometimes things that I don't know ever existed in Rome. And he sort of spreads them throughout the city, almost like spreading butter on toast, recreating imperial Rome in his imagination. So while Piranesi is the anti-Boulez, Rome had her own map-making architect, an older contemporary, Giambattista Noli. From 1736, Noli surveyed the city of Rome for the Pianta Grande di Roma. He also produced 12 copper plate engravings, framed with vedute, so the images you can see of what was modern Rome on the right and imperial Rome on the left. And now we just call it the Noli map. His fame rests on his figure-ground representation of the city, in which built form and private space are both pochade in black, while public space, interiors and public buildings, as well as streets and piazza, are left white. In 1978, Costantino Dardi, an architect and designer for the exhibition in the Greenaway film, took part in an exhibition entitled Rome Interrupted that took as its premise the 1748 Nolli map of Rome and invited 9 prominent postmodern architects of the era that included Aldo Rossi, Robin Leon Creer, James Stirling, Michael Graves, Robert Venturi, and John Rausch, urbanist Colin Rao, along with initiator of the Architectural Biennale in Venice, Paolo Portoghese, to reinvent a section of the Nolli maps. Each was either assigned or chose a particular section. Stirling took the opportunity to showcase all of his other projects by projecting them on Rome, while Venturi, you can see Venturi's square there, reimagined Rome as a Las Vegasan city of signs. Dardi was fortunate to have as his section the Trident, that's the center top, and the Corso, and an area that included the Augustus tomb and the Trinità de Monte. So this is his scheme. He contrasts Piranesi's imaginative reconstructions of the Campo Marzio, which we'll look at in a minute, which are only a few years apart from Nolli's scientific mapping of Rome's public and private spaces that set the tone for scientific rather than expressive mapping of Rome. Working with the 18th century city, in which the Piazza del Popolo is an oblong with 2 matching churches, he plays with linearity in the form of furrowed fields of agriculture. This is 1978, so it's like the era of ecology, and lines of greenhouses, as well as a practical approach that introduces functional aspects of infrastructure to the city. The Valadier elliptical layout of the Piazza del Popolo is reintroduced into the Nolli oblong. Augustus' tomb, that's the circle that you see sort of to the middle, is reintroduced, is opened as a punctum or node on a reintroduced geometry, both of the river and of the Trident itself. In the 20th century, just because I really pick up on the Augustus tomb, which is here. In the 20th century, for purposes of iconic monumentality and to emphasize the power of fascism, Mussolini's architects isolated key Roman monuments, such as the Tomb of Augustus, by stripping away what was referred to as decadent urban fabric, and built new works of rationalist architecture, which, though modernist and abstract, derived their imagery, monumental scale, and political force from classical antiquity. Mussolini ceremoniously began the demolition to liberate the mausoleum of Augustus, and it coincided with, to celebrate 2,000 years of Augustus' birth. This liberation brought together fascism and the Roman Empire through the freeing of architecture of death on the anniversary of the emperor's birth. The supposed intention was to open up the urban design for traffic and a form of what he referred to as urban hygiene by demolishing the existing buildings and streets and relocating all the people who lived there to the area of Garbatello. This is what it looked like before his demolition, where it was completely embedded within the medieval fabric. And the top right is Dardi's proposal for opening up the Tomb of Augustus, or for, in 78, he would be changing it from what Mussolini had designed with his architect Morpurgo in the 1950s, which you see on the bottom left, which is kind of how you see it today, except we now have the Richard Meyer Etapachus on the Ripetta riverfront. Other people have imagined what the Tomb of Augustus was like. This is Allo Giovinoli, a veduta from the early 17th century. What it might have been like at the time of Augustus, And this multi-layered wedding cake idea is described in one of the classical texts, which is why in the Vedute it gets constantly reproduced, although it doesn't look like anything that is familiar to me from classical architecture. This is Piranesi's version of the Tomb of Augustus as a ruin. The view from the film and the postcard from the film. Although it's not part of one of the monuments of the Greenaway film, I also traced depictions of the pyramid, as to me it represents the ultimate foreigner in Rome. For not only is it a Roman tomb in the form of an Egyptian pyramid, but it's also where the English cemetery has been laid out, the final resting place of Keats and Shelley. And these are earlier vedute. The pyramid, by the way, has been incorporated into the Aurelian walls. And here we're on the outside, the top right we're on the inside, and in these later vedute, in these, you can see how it's been, the pyramid itself has been excavated so that you can get into an entrance. And we see here these monuments, here this column, which we see here, here, and some of these tombs are the tombs of the non-Catholics who perished in Rome and were buried there, including Keats and Shelley. I looked at many maps of Rome trying to understand how different people portrayed Rome in different times and how that affects our perception of the city now. And in looking at many of the maps and the depictions and the vedute, I started to play a little game with myself of spot the Pantheon. And even in the earlier reconstructions of Rome, you can still play a similar game. This is a very small piece of Piranesi's Campo Marzio, where he also reconstructs Rome as it might have been in the 18th century, if designed by someone on laudanum, I guess, because it doesn't look like any Roman architecture I've ever seen. We have things that we can recognize. You can see the Pantheon on the top left. And this thing here is the Orologica Augustum, Augustus sundial, which used the obelisk, which is now in the Piazza del Popolo, to tell the time. It wasn't always accurate, but Pliny says that sometimes if it didn't tell the exact time or the exact date, it's because the Earth was not rotating correctly on axis, that sometimes the Earth would shift on axis, and that's why it was less accurate, because you could not doubt the verity of the Emperor Augustus. It had to be the Earth that wasn't rotating properly. There's a new pyramid there, sort of not quite equilateral triangle, and all of this, what does it look like? Did it ever exist in Roman times? And behind the Pantheon, we also have the Baths of Agrippa, which we know existed because we have some ruins, and also we know about them from literature. You can just keep going in and going in and going into this plan and finding more. But the Pantheon itself is constantly depicted in different ways by different people, always trying to find the same kind of view, which shows the building at its most iconic, whether it's from the interior or the exterior, how you cite the obelisk. Are these pictures taken before the obelisk was created? The top left is actually Cinecittà. No, sorry, the top left is the real Pantheon, the bottom left is Cinecittà, because it shows the particular and very recognizable brickwork on the drum of the Pantheon, which is part of what makes it so beautiful, and it's how we recognize it. So all you need to do is reproduce these images in detail, even if you're completely changing the scale, changing the perspective, changing the way it's used of the Pantheon itself. Earlier depictions before the construction of the two bell towers show a campanile in the center, old Roman fountains, some of the artifacts that are in the piazza, like the stone lion and the baths, had been there since about the year 900 when they were described, but these images were done later. Our friend Duparac again, what is he doing to the Pantheon? He's sort of putting on a Renaissance rustication on the ground floor and filling up that beautiful brickwork with I don't know what, putting statues everywhere as if he's been over-reading Filaret. Why would anyone do that to the Pantheon? And Piranesi's view of the Baths of Agrippa, which is probably familiar, it's a famous vedute, this one on the top left, as if you're looking through the ruins at the Pantheon itself. And I started to think, well, where was he standing when he did this, actually? So I looked at an old map. This is where the ruins of Agrippa are, the Thermae. So there's actually no place you could stand and get that view. Plus, there's actual medieval buildings there. It didn't look like that in Piranesi's time. It doesn't look like that now. He's completely reinventing it, almost like the set designers in Cinecittà are constantly reinventing Rome, reinventing cities, reinventing places to best present them. The bottom left is the view of the Pantheon from the Greenaway film. And here is Piranesi's view of the Pantheon from his Campo Marzio. But he's not showing it as it appeared in his era, which is 1762. He's showing it as it appeared in the earlier images that I showed, where part of the pediment has broken off. These columns are without capitals. But it didn't look like that in his era, so he'd been looking at earlier images as well. And this is his imagination of what Rome looked like in Roman times, where he's reconstructed it with the baths behind the Pantheon and the Colosseum. Books of vedute also show what people were looking for at the time. So I'll quickly go through these vedute by Duparac, where the name changes from the sort of antiquities of Rome to, the marvels of Rome. They're almost the same, except in the view of the Forum, we're looking towards the Campidoglio from the Forum, the sort of peasants leading their donkeys in the foreground, 100 years later turn to some very well-dressed tourists who are viewing the Forum, although and they've arrived by carriage, although the image itself is the same. Then 50 years later, it's a little bit tidied up so we can really focus on the architecture and the pictorial aspects. I've shown some of the vedute by Alogio Venoli, who always contrasts the power of imperial Rome with the power of Christianity, which was prevalent in his era in the 17th century, quite specifically by enacting particular scenes in front of the ruins. And he sets scenes of often quite violent martyrdom in front of the Baths of Caracalla. What interests me the most about this is that the Baths of Caracalla today are the backdrop to opera. And if you go to the opera in Rome during the summer, they're performed in front of the Baths of Caracalla. And in the 17th century, they're perceived in the same way, as backdrop for very emotive and dramatic action. And there's an entire book of vedute of the Baths of Caracalla, each of which depict not just a different ruin, but a different Christian martyrdom, none of which actually happened in that place, certainly not at that time, but they happened all over the world, but they've all been set in front of the Baths of Caracalla. including throwing the Christians to the lions, which took place in the Colosseum. And here we have it taking place in Giovanoli's Vedute in front of the Colosseum. And the Colosseum itself is depicted in many different ways by different artists over different eras. Oh, here we have, if you look at the horse in the background, this is a reconstruction of what the Colosseum might have looked like in the time of Rome, another by Duperac. Now we've got, from a different era, the Colosseum as it looked at the time, but with the same horse and rider. The Colosseum from the film, and the Square Colosseum. This is another image from the film, from Mussolini's EUR. In the Greenaway film, one of the iconic architectural works from Mussolini's Third Rome is the Square Colosseum, which the Italians in the film are siphoning off funds from the Boulay exhibition to support this, and the Foro Italico. And this I also refer to spolia, the spoils of war. The medieval urban fabric of Rome adaptively reused early building materials, often referred to as spolia, when they're incorporated into other buildings. This building, which is actually the American Academy, becomes a hospital in the film, and you can see the spolia that decorate the walls. On account of the construction on older foundations and the use of spolia, one finds key public spaces persisting in Rome, which you could see in the plans. One example is the Piazza Navona, which maintains its original form as a stadium. These are 6 postcards from the Greenaway film. Greenaway himself, with his endless film references, uses both Tarkovsky and Bernardo Bertolucci as his own spoils of war to lend credence, decorative framing, and monument to his film. It's richly decorated with statues. It's likely a historic precedent for Mussolini's Olympic Stadium, whose famous athletic figures make an appearance in the film, like the stadium that we saw earlier, designed by Kettelhut in Metropolis. St. Peter's, the Christian seat of power in Rome, appears undramatically and more than halfway through the film. As Cracklight adopts to Rome and Roman power, the magnificence of Michelangelo's elliptical piazza and dome reveal themselves almost modestly. And it's interesting that Greenaway keeps Michelangelo's familiar dome and piazza from us, the viewer, until his character has given up his fight to neoclassically dominate Rome and the Romans. So back to maps quite quickly, because we've examined the urban typology here. Now we're looking at the other end of the Corso, which ends at this time with the Campidoglio. And the Piazza Venezia, this building, in the time of the early 20th century, the construction of the Vittoriano was entirely taken down and moved to a site over here to open up the piazza, because this site here becomes the monument of the Vittoriano, which you can see in the bottom right. This is an RAF photograph taken during the Second World War. You can see the clearing of the Augustus tomb. The little dot, that's the oculus of the Pantheon that seems to sort of follow us as we move around through Rome, and the end of the axis of the Corso at the Vittoriano, which is celebrated not in the building itself, but in Cinecittà, in an exhibition there. Cinecittà was Mussolini's brainchild for spreading propaganda. And these are images from Cinecittà, from the exhibition there, creating Cinecittà, but also comparing and contrasting it to the monumentality of the Vittoriano, as it appears in a postcard from the film and in the film itself. And at the end of the film, our hero stands at the top at his exhibition. He looks out at a view. He's standing on the Nolli map. He looks down. At his feet, we see the Pantheon, and when he looks out, he sees the dome of St. Peter's. The filmic Rome points to itself. celebrating both Caesars and Mussolini, fetishizing history, and glorifying architectural expressions of power. Thank you.
I think I became interested in architecture and in Italy at the same time, because when I was at school, in the science lab, somehow the boys, my fellow boys, had got hold of a film promoting Pirelli tires. It was called The Tortoise and the Hare. And it plotted a journey through Italy where a truck carrying Pirelli tires and an E-Type driven by a very attractive blonde were traveling up through Italy. And of course I couldn't wait to get to Italy, and from then on not only discovered architecture but Italian cinema. And I just want to show you a single clip from Pasolini's Medea. It starts, guess what, with the everyday. We are in a house outside Corinth, and Medea, played by Maria Callas, has resolved to do away with Jason, who has got a new love inside the city. But what I'd like you to observe in watching this clip is how the continuity of the action actually joins completely different spaces together to create the illusion of outside and inside the city.
Nurse, accompany me. Nurse, accompany me.
Where?
To Corinth.
You mustn't.
Accompany me.
It's my assertion that there could be no film without architecture, and consequently, perhaps no architecture without film. What I'm going to talk about is how that sensibility, the perceptions that perhaps are tied up in why I showed you that clip, are also visible in architectural space. I mean, in the clip, I find it remarkable that Pasolini, like in many of his films, was able to use real places that possibly were very known to the audience of the time. I don't recognize the depiction of Corinth, but I suspect it was nowhere near where the inner part of the city is depicted, which is Pisa's cathedral and Campanile fields. a very flat city. But the montage is such that we're entirely convinced by the passage of those two figures, through that gateway in the city walls into that open space. Of course, accompanied by the drama of the figure, Maria Callas, more dramatic because she doesn't sing throughout the film. So, back to an architectural space, the Villa Giulia, which is one of my favorite buildings, where I realized that there was a kind of architectural montage going on when I first visited this place. You enter the compound from the left-hand side through that facade, an incredibly imposing and yet delightful facade, because as the Villa Giulia, the Pope Julius II's villa, just outside the city walls of Rome, you're entering essentially a Roman house, but not quite as you would expect it. So as you pass through that first archway, experience the constriction of that first arch, and then move out into a kind of auditorium-like arcade that embraces you as you move into those central spaces. And ahead of you is a kind of a distanced version of the Chênaie fronts of the Roman theatre, a triumphal arch which is on axis ahead of you. This sketch is something that I did at the time that I first went there, which would be in the late 70s. I had a grant from the Italian government to go and study gardens and Italian theatres and how they crossed over. And it was very evident to me that this was theatrical and based on perceptions in time and space. You'll see at the bottom the enclosure of the arcade, the triumphal arch ahead of you, but imperceptible from the main courtyard is this nymphaeum which lies below it. And as you move through the spaces, you are held together by symmetry, but teased and redirected away from it in order to enrich your perception of the place. If you were to look back for a moment, you'd see that arcade that you'd already passed through and entering the space, and into the nymphaeum, which unfolds a series of levels that you have to unravel by deviating from the axis in order to overcome the apparent distance, and in distance there is also magic. So we're being treated to an everydayness, if you count classical architecture as a tangible, understandable language, but also to magic, as most clearly displayed in the Nymphaeum, where the myth of Leda and the Swan relocates our experience in mythical space and not only physical space. So we've had this image already today, but I cite it here because Rem Koolhaas's Elements of Architecture Biennale really missed out space. It was the glaring absence that when you take architecture apart, a bit like a child's toy, construction toy of Lego bricks or various other versions that I guess the older ones of us had as children, you can deconstruct the building into many single elements, but in doing so, you leave space out of it, or indeed the experience of space. If I recall correctly, Rem had in that very first room in the theme pavilion, there were a series of movie clips of actresses, actors coming down staircases, opening windows, standing by shelves, all of those, and of course that is a way of looking at film. But that's not how I looked at it. And I'm showing here an image from Bernard Tschumy's Manhattan Transfers. He was my tutor here in this building when I was a student in the early 70s. And the discussions that he brought to the table began as political ones, began with lots of reference to French philosophical theory. He then became interested in notation, partly through the work of Bruce MacLean and his performance band called Nice Style, and studies in Eisenstein's theory of montage. And Bernard was very provocatively and tangibly able to parallel a work of architecture as seen with a plan, with a sequence of movement. But I would say that as I got to be more adept at expressing ideas of my own as opposed to those of my tutor, it seemed to me that to turn notation physically into buildings, and we're talking about kind of walls and structure, was not necessarily giving architecture its most vital quality, which in my terms are the experience of space. And just going back for a second to Medea, one of the key characters who sets the scene is the centaur. And I know this guy looks a bit like a pantomime horse, but at the same time is a very beautiful a kind of encapsulation for me of what it means to look behind you, because he has the young Jason on his back, but as if you were in a car and looking behind you, looking in the rear view mirror, there's a space behind you, but you're not always aware of it. You can't necessarily see it through the rectangular frame of cinema, but you kind of know it's there. And that feeling of being able to see behind you, to kind of to synthesize the space in a dynamic way as you move through it, is something that film goes to great lengths to reproduce. But in architecture, perhaps it's simpler and more instinctive to do so. And I guess at the time that I was becoming a sort of fully fledged independent thinker, cinema was very important in London life. A friend of mine, who I brought here to this building very often, was Derek Jarman, who became a celebrated filmmaker before Peter Greenaway, who I also had some engagement with. But Derek's most ambitious film in the early part of his film career was Jubilee. And Jubilee explored the possibilities of the age of Queen Elizabeth II connecting with Queen Elizabeth I, but set in a very, very derelict version of London. There's a gasometer in the background, there's a collapsed figure on the ground, a crashed car, weirdly this phrase postmodern on the wall. Was that really a punky slogan? But in this movie, all of these worlds come together, of royalty, aristocracy, and the trashed version of London that we were living in, which incidentally I think was responsible for some of the great creativity that was here in this city in the late 70s and early 80s. So when I was a student here, I used to use a 5H pencil. Then some years later, 1980 to be precise, I spent some time in New York. And in New York, there was a complete revolution in terms of contemporary art. Suddenly, abstract and formal expressionism were being overturned by what came to be called the trans-avant-garde, which was represented by Italian artists like Clemente, Inzuccucchi, Sandokia, British artists like Schnabel, painting was back, but it was vigorous painting, and it had a sense of action and motion about it. And I wanted to do the same thing in architecture. I wanted to design buildings that felt as though they were moving, that were actually blistering with the sense of dynamism that one might get traveling very fast down a mountainside. In fact, this was inspired by an artist called Namjoon Paik, who made a video of a skier going down a mountainside with kind of colors rushing past, and it was the intensity of this experience. And you might not think this looks like the building is rushing, but I was attempting through the drawing style and the form of the building to explore dynamic language with tilted columns, with these strange kind of sticks or fur, giant fur on one side of the building that would make it look as though it was blurred, that would bring an experience of kind of, the building would emphasize this sense of transition through it as if you were a skier. And by doing this, I'd found certainly a vision of architecture which put the figure into the scene. And sometimes that figure was myself, and that was very concurrent with the need to put, as an artist, to put yourself into your work. The I was kind of important. The agency of the I could allow you to stand in, as it were, for members of the public. And in this project, which was shown in a small gallery in Florence in 1983, I think, it proposed a public toilet in a very, very imperious setting in the middle of the Piazzale degli Uffizi, surrounded by some of the most famous art in the world, but somehow underground. And in this, there's a layout of cubicles, which of course couldn't be simpler in terms of architectural definition of space. The cubicle is the kind of reduced version, the sort of shed end of the interior. But in this drawing, it's suggesting in this environment, it would encourage, through its kind of banality and simplicity, a kind of rocking bacchanalian nighttime activity. In fact, this is called the night lives of the artists. And the artists are kind of the local boys and girls who are using it, adopting it as a nightclub, which I think is making out of a place the suggestion that, like in the Medea clip, that places are not necessarily used for what they were originally designated by the architect. And I think that kind of schism is partly to do with, you know, what makes architecture become more exciting when viewed in the course of action or through the mise en scène. This is a page from a book that we did here called The Discourse of Events, and it charts the projects that were set by Bernard and through the unit when I took over from him. And by 1981-82, I'd actually begun to set a progressive sequence of projects that started with making an object, and then students would be asked to make a film out of an object. The objects, I think, this year should express modern life, but perhaps modern life in a slightly surrealistic dimension. So once the students had completed their films, only after that did I ask them to make storyboards. So it was kind of doing it the wrong way around, deliberately, because the film therefore couldn't be that self-conscious. The storyboard would be a kind of unwrapping, a bit like doing a measured drawing of an existing building. And these storyboards, of course, were long and thin, drawn by hand. And we then used these storyboards to position over the part of the city that we were looking at, which was the Isle of Dogs, where we proposed that the Isle of Dogs should become a kind of autonomous state called Giant-Sized Babytown. And through the overlaying of these storyboards, we were able to come up with, let's say, a kind of montage across the cityscape, which incorporated the existing docks and existing buildings, but then occasionally would create the need for something new. And it was out of that that the students were able to come up with quite a radical vision of what the Isle of Dogs might be like, which included cranes and derelict buildings, but also new walkways and transformed buildings that seemed to incorporate a movie dimension of everyday life, such as this prostitute who's hanging out in the view on the right-hand side, and somebody on a scooter on an overhead walkway. And how, through Mark Prizeman's drawings, this might be brought to satisfy the requirements of the AA and the need of a diploma to demonstrate that you could actually do a proper drawing of a building, which is what there is across the bottom, which is a sort of smudgy, but let's say in principle measured drawing that actually shows you how these various elements and these various acts of transformation had been brought to bear on this part of London. The next year, we went on and did the same sort of thing. This is one of the products, the objects made by the students at the beginning of the year. It's a device for dispensing red or white wine, but you have to get onto the floor and suck the teats in order to be satisfied with the wine. And it's too long to describe here, but the work of this group of students was so different from anything that had been experienced in the school before that it caused a kind of collapse at the diploma committee. And although the work was eventually passed, Alvin Boyarsky's suggestion was that we should do a book to explain why our work was worthwhile, but instead of a book, we wanted to do a magazine, which was much more in the mood of the time. And this magazine uniquely had a face on the cover. There had been no architecture magazine that we knew of that actually brought together the figure and architecture and the city to really describe architecture as a living thing with people in it. Maybe the people weren't exactly like the people you saw in the street, but you know, the one on the right-hand side at the bottom, he's wearing an old Mac. The woman in the center with the hat, she's kind of digging, she's got a spade, but there's a general mood in the whole of this issue of NATO magazine, which is about making things for yourselves, actually taking hold of the city as a stance in architecture. And my own drawings at this time were covered in arrows and kind of this sense of transformation of buildings and the expression of not only an organic kind of architecture, but the notion that the city itself was a kind of continuous building site. This drawing was part of a show that was upstairs here called Arc Albion. And it looked at how one might transform the South Bank around County Hall and St Thomas's Hospital, Westminster Bridge, into a kind of living exhibition of architecture in which these sorts of perceptions of space, such as I showed you in the Villa Giulia, could come to pass in a built form of architecture. Not long after that, I was found by a man in Japan who said, "We want you to come and build stuff for us over here." Why he came to London is perhaps because London, as I said, was bursting with energy. And lots of people that I knew had been invited to go and appear in fashion shows or kind of contribute to the scene, make nightclubs, be cool people around Tokyo. And so when I went to Japan for the first time, I was amazed to find that Tokyo was already like NATO had imagined London. It was a continuous building site. Electronics were integrated with the living environment. There was a kind of feeling that everyone was kind of removing unnecessary outer clothing and enjoying the city in a sort of maelstrom of experience. Much more down to earth, perhaps, is this project by NATO for a house for Derek Jarman, which was an exhibition at the RIBA, in which it was called Star Choice, I think. And each of the people that were invited, NATO was invited as a group, were asked to choose a star to design a house for. So we chose Derek Jarman, and Derek in turn chose Dancing Ledge, Winspit in Dorset, for his perfect house, which was, and still is, an abandoned quarry at the top of the cliffs overlooking the Dorset coast. And in this quarry, there was an old engine house. And that's where he wanted his own ideal home to be. And so the design, which was contributed to by all members of the NATO group, incorporated some of his other obsessions, which curiously go back to ancient Rome and all of that. He was obsessed with scrolls and statuary appearing from within the ground. In other words, this sort of mythical world of ruins and transformation being evident in the place that he could live. But in Tokyo, my second project, first project was a relatively kind of well-behaved restaurant. The second project, the clients wanted a new cafe in their department store building called PART2. And this window, as it were, had been a cafe already, but the owners of the department store wanted to do something which reflected the mood of the moment. And in 1985, I think the mood of the moment was that for the Japanese wanted to travel more than they'd ever wanted to travel before. They were coming in huge numbers to Europe and absorbing a kind of European sense of proportion and history, and how that history could be incorporated into a cool sense of the moment. So, trying to read the psychology behind the request, I thought it would be appropriate to make this cafe based on Fellini's La Dolce Vita. And I took all the artists and architects, of which there were about 20, to a BFI private viewing cinema on Charing Cross Road to watch the film together. So there was Tom Dixon, Andre Debray, set designer called Zaza Wentworth Stanley, and about half a dozen other people, painters, art photographers, and so on, plus our own team. So this building, which sadly, at least this cafe, which sadly no longer exists, was able to take the atmosphere of La Dolce Vita, in which Anita Ekberg, the Swedish actress, has just arrived in Rome. She's mobbed by paparazzi, and I think that notion of paparazzi was kind of new at the time. And the film unfolds in all of these people, including Marcello Mastroianni, chasing her from one fabulous setting to the next. And I thought this was a great narrative to incorporate into this cafe. In fact, the Dolce Vita was showing on little video screens that were set in the floor underneath glass panels. We built pieces of Roman ruin at the back of the space, using all the theatrical techniques possible of plastic sheets of brickwork, and tons of rubbish, including telephones and various other detritus from here, which was airlifted to Japan to be incorporated into this project. Like the drawing of the Villa Giulia, I suppose this sort of drawing had become part of my method, which is to look at the eddies and foci of human experience and overlay them on the city as we find it. And this is a kind of exploratory drawing for a project I called X de City, which was in the gallery here opposite. And it looks at part of London adjacent to the river between Trafalgar Square on the left and St. Paul's on the right, adopting the city as it was, which wasn't necessarily the approach taken by some of my fellow teachers and architects, like Zaha Hadid, for example. But I wanted to, as it were, explore the potential to energize the city as we knew it by overlaying it with a series of elements that were derived from this kind of imaginary choreography, this identification of energy in the urban landscape. And so some of the buildings that you might be able to pick out, the bit in the middle is Somerset House, with it's shown here as pink, but the pink bit to the left of it is clearly not part of the London scenery of the time. Also, some of these pontoons and strange kind of arrow shapes seem to slip and slide into the river, and like the river itself, appear to be moving. And X de City, in turn, translated into some buildings like the National Centre for Pop Music in Sheffield, which lasted only a few months before its very lack of content internally forced it to close and turn into the music student union building at Sheffield Hallam University. But the point of showing this, really, is that it is a device, at least this is how I conceived of it, which makes you aware, like the Villa Giulia, of how you move progressively through it. It consists of 4 drums with a roof that is like a cross that sits in between those drums, and you can enter from any side. And as you enter, you are, as it were, like a piece of steel passing through 2 rollers that are pushing you through that axis. So it's a play of axes and a play of geometry with the intention of unraveling and accentuating both your disorientation and your attempts to configure the space around yourself. And that theme of centralized space was also true in this space I did at the Venice Biennale of 2008, which is a collaboration with John Maybury, who's here today, who helped me realize the film, in which male dancers were being architecture. It doesn't look like it here, but this screen was a circular screen, continuous circular screen of 8 meters across, with 6 projectors working in all directions, and some furniture that I'd done to encapsulate the idea of sensuality in physical sensuality in this space, which was meant to fulfill the request of the curator Aaron Betsky to make a sensual installation. And I thought the most sensual piece of furniture possible is the saddle, the English saddle, because it's a bit like a piece of furniture, but it's connected to a horse, and the horse and you can't really ride unless you've got some kind of understanding. And I wanted that sensibility to come across in this space, which, although with a moving image, we realized when we built it that actually reflected the typical composition of a palatial Venetian interior, with giant frescoes, albeit moving ones, opulent furniture, beautiful large chandeliers. But in this case, the chandeliers are like floating clouds, and they have models of cities perched on them. And I'd just end with my current project, which is one of my projects of the mind, never meant to be built, rooted in reality, let's say plausibility, but also magically, hopefully creating a kind of magic understanding of what a city could be. So this sort of city exists in your imagination. But first of all, it has to exist in mine. It's a reworking of the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens next to Vauxhall Bridge, part of London which has been pretty much decimated by the toxic combination of the American Embassy and St. George's Wharf, which I think is one of the ugliest buildings in London, which is not to say much. But the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens were there before the railways were built, and therefore before the tiny patch of green that remains, as called Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, was cut off from the river. But in my new version of it, there's a very large figure there to greet you next to the railway lines, and various kind of little mini projects that are like a series of pavilions in an 18th century garden, which is basically what Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens was. It was you paid your shilling to go in, and you listened to music, and you ate food, and heard recitation, and probably finished up the evening canoodling with prostitutes under the trees. It was kind of ahead of its time, wasn't it? But this is just one of those watercolors, which are actually, in reality, tiny like this. All of these pieces are based on digital models of artifacts that I found online, and these ones are based on skirts and guns, but also fused together with the pattern that is so familiar to anyone who's grown up in England, the willow pattern plate, which I know is not cinema, but it has the kind of circularity if you were to hybridize cinema and architecture into a single thing. And if you remember the story of the two lovers who are disapproved of by the woman's father, so he kills the pair of them, and so they become doves in the air and spend the rest of their lives kind of flying around. Thank you very much.
Listening to Nigel, I thought it was in some way a kind of, it was like after Francois and René, it was like a dialectical thing of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, because you were on about like modesty of everyday life, you were on about an extremely extravagant city and some even more extravagant visions of that city from Piranesi and others, and Nigel is sort of somehow playing across both of them. I don't know. Does that seem? I mean, John, come on. You know Nigel's work very well, but I don't really know Francois and René's. How did you Because I had to put these three together, you see.
I had connections, I felt connections to everybody's talks, actually, and it was interesting because, I mean, I was interested in your emphasis on the ordinary. And the first images that came to my mind when I was looking at your examples were from very extraordinary films. I was thinking about Maya Deren, Meshes of the Afternoon. I was thinking about Jean Genet and Jean Cocteau, in fact, and the use of doors and the way that those frame devices within the frame device of the screen open up another landscape. But it's always very interesting for me to listen to people talking about film. I mean, I work as a filmmaker in lots of different ways. I started in non-narrative film. I made experimental film. I moved into feature film, narrative filmmaking. I've worked in television on kind of large-scale storytelling, which brought me around to connecting with Rome, because I directed a couple of episodes of Rome, including the season finale, which ended the whole show. I had the experience, the Roman experience, which we were talking about over lunch, of living in Rome and working at Cinecittà. I was living in 21st century Rome and going to first century Rome every day to do work.
Well, it sounds like life, but not everyday life.
It's my everyday life. No, and then, strangely, Nigel shows a still from Jubilee, which was the first job I ever did. Derek asked me to do the punk sets and costumes on Jubilee. So no, actually, I didn't do that. I didn't. There were other people dipping it. Derek would always get other people to do things that were relevant to him. It is my handwriting and my graffiti through most of the film, though. But anyway, no. So it's interesting that all these disparate elements told a story of my life today. In something that's quite dry and academic on one level, I felt completely engaged with because I saw a kind of unintentional biography on the screens, and I guess that's where film and architecture come together in a very interesting way, because they frame all of our lives. They're touchstones films are touchstones for us. Obviously, buildings are experiential on every level anyway, cities and buildings. So yeah, I find it kind of fascinating, the narratives of these different elements come together and we're able to kind of point at me very specifically.
But Francois, you're obviously doing more than simply an anthropological survey here. You're not just doing a sort of typological log of how people sit at tables and so on. You're in an architecture department, and so there's a proactive design projective agenda. And when that comes into question, there's then the question really of what would count as, let's say, a predictable action, and something that is not so predictable but plausible, which was Nigel's use of the term. Because in a way, the problem with everyday life from my imagination is it's like the opposite of my complaint about digital movies letting you walk up the wall. So it's like as if it shades off into a kind of banal survey. So there's some kind of way in which the movies enable us to recover something extraordinary from these intimate and daily situations. Could you say something about how have you sensed that emerging in the project, that in a sense you're beginning to catch other things other than just how to boil a kettle?
Yes, I think the cultural comparison is very early to say exactly what we're going to come up with. I mean, it's 6 months into a 2.5 year project, so I think one has to admit that research is something which develops as it goes along. But certainly for the book, and I think that you, Nigel, hinted that I think that I feel that there is no direct translation between filmmaking and architecture. I mean, I think the architectural anthropology, the spatial ethnography, I think is the post-occupancy archive. I think is a huge field that we have yet to analyze. But I think that at the end of my book, I thought, well, perhaps if only. I mean, they were. Yes, I mean, I was trying to think of. I mean, I became quite close to the writing of my colleague, who by that time had just died, Dalibor Vesely, and this issue of situations. I found it very interesting how film is capable of making us understand and simplify complex situations, and sort of makes visible what is invisible, but permanently available sets of relationships potentially. But so situation, atmosphere, was, but essentially I thought that I'm still absolutely interested in the everyday and in everyday life, and I concluded that if anything, if this could revive an interest in what Lefebvre called the minor magic of everyday life, then I would have achieved my goal. Which is potentially very modest, but...
little sort of clinomens or swerves away from normality. Is that...
Well, I think that, I think in even, I mean, in every film, and, I had not realized that for all those years I was working on the everyday, but as sometimes one traces back one's life and you can realize what you've been doing, and this is probably what I was...
I mean, I can sort of see one value straight away in this, in that my sense, I mean, I don't know what anyone else thinks here, but I teach history and theory mostly, but I've taught some studio. One thing that strikes me straight away with architecture students is that it's notable that you can understand why there are no architectural prodigies, like there are mathematical and musical prodigies, because I don't think you can design buildings until you know how to live. If you ask a 19-year-old, 18-year-old student to design a house, probably never actually thought about how he actually lives in his own house or his mum's and dad's own house. So I imagine a study of the everyday in that sense is a kind of revelation.
No, that's exactly what I've been saying, is that film provides an extraordinary accelerated education in life. It's an equipment for living. And I think that in itself is a huge object lesson.
The question is, how far does the quotidian extend? Because our lives are also, we hope, interspersed with extraordinary deviations and events. Yeah. And this word event was an important kind of occurrence in Diploma 10. Yeah. It was like an event is something which is an exception to the case. It's rather like that definition of information. The information is the exception to the series, or the definition of news, where you say, well, dog bites man is not news, man bites dog is news, because it's an exception. And I think that things like nightclubs, holidays, skiing are extraordinary sort of, they're rather like flares on the surface of the sun.
Yeah, they're using the extreme, but they rely on a kind of you need to understand the mountain. You need to be able to, you understand the city as a construct within which you can make those extraordinary events such as a nightclub. and they're kind of binary opposites, aren't they? Also in the films that you were showing, we didn't see much of them intentionally, but it was probably, the ordinary is a device for laying the ground against which to create a dramatic moment.
Absolutely.
And I mean, John will probably expand on this, but the business of framing the life, you know, the kitchen sink, and framing the face, the architecture is the room, but we're talking about the kind of relation between the flow of events in a place.
Yes.
So don't they kind of need each other to the extraordinary? And a film that was just kind of like Andy Warhol's films where nothing much happens have always fascinated me. And you know, whenever I've made kind of simple films, they're usually films that are soaking in the space, but then nothing much happens in them. Maybe it's just a very, very slow pan across a city scene, but I get something out of that.
I've always thought movies really ought to be called changes, because when Warhol filmed the Empire State Building, nothing moves, but something does change. The light changes. And what film really records is change, surely.
It also depends on the way you watch it. So if you watch it like an opera that goes on for 5 hours, or you watch Netflix, which goes on for 5 weeks, then it's a different kind of rhythm from, you know, the cinema is not just the 1.5 hour feature film.
One connection between what you said, Nigel, and Renee, when you introduced the Nolly plan, because you made the point that your film excerpt is a little kind of section from the interior to the exterior of the city. And that was the accomplishment of Nolly, in a sense, by mapping Rome for the first time, showing public interiors as a continuity with public exteriors. And it raises very directly the question of what exactly is film bringing to this, because I think it's a point I tried to touch on at the beginning this morning when I said, you know, drawings, maps, plans, sections, models provide certain kinds of architectural information. What specifically significant new information does film, or can moving images bring? And in, for instance, René's film of the Bibliothèque Nationale, which I will show a little bit of myself, I couldn't help being struck by the difference between what one learns of the library from that film, from what I learned of Labrouste, the architect of the library, at that tremendous show in the Museum of Modern Art a few years ago. I mean, there were all the plans, all the documents, the tectonics were all laid out, the building, the construction, and so on. But they are information mostly about chunks of metal, stone, and wood. When you watch René's film, people using the library, the program comes to life. Floor.
There was one thing I did want to say, and someone mentioned earlier, just we arrived late, so I missed the full conversation, but someone talked about the first close-up, I seem to remember. I think that was discussed in the silent era, the first huge face on a screen. I think the architecture of the face is a very important aspect of cinema, the face itself and the close-up. It's the thing that sets film as an art form apart from all others, because until film came along, we never saw faces 60 foot high. And the subtlety of the movement across Lillian Gish's eyes, or Greta Garbo's eyes, or even, you know, now Jennifer Lawrence's eyes, something happens in the dynamic of that connection with the human face in cinema, and the scale of the human face, that I think is very important. And there is an architecture of the face. It's why some people are photogenic and other people are not. So I just wanted to chuck that out there.
I think that's very important for the simple reason that it gives me a lead into what I've got to announce, which is that Mark needs to give his lecture as was planned at 4. So therefore, and he's going to talk about vertigo, I think, and Kim Novak's face is rather important in that. And so I will, without ado, invite Mark to take the lectern once more. Thank you.